In this video, I want to talk about one of the chapters, namely Chapter 6, Act Utilitarianism, in this book. This chapter is very interesting. It's packed with a lot of stuff. This is just to get you going on thinking about what's up with this notion of act utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is, there's zillions of different kinds. It's incredible how many different kinds of utilitarianism that you can find. We're looking at what's called act utilitarianism. Now, act utilitarianism is a typical utilitarianism ethical theory in that morality is an issue of overall well-being. And I've talked about well-being, and I'll be talking in a few earlier videos, and I'll return to this again and again. But remember, well-being is the central concept of 20th century versions of utilitarianism. So it's typical in that sense. It's a concern with overall well-being. I'll talk a little bit more about overall well-being in a second here, but it's unique in that it's quite a straightforward utilitarianism. When we think about consequences, when we're talking about, oh yeah, ethics deals with rightness and wrongness, and rightness and wrongness of what? Well, what you do, the consequences of what you do. It seemed pretty straightforward to say that, I'm judged on my actions, and I'm really, blamed or whatever, and held responsible, and all these things that we associate with talking about morality really are, well, what kind of effect did you have on the world? Did you leave it a worse place than you found it, or a better place? And that's how we often talk, right? I want to be a good person. I leave the world better than I found it. And that really is attributing it to me, the agent, or you, the agent, or Joe or Sally or whomever, what they do, so their actions. So that's the straightforward nature of, and why it's called, act utilitarianism. You don't always have to look at utilitarianism under that model, because there are different things that you can ask, what are the consequences of? So in this case, it's acts or actions. So it's pretty straightforward. So so the basic idea is that there you go. There's your basic unit is the act done by a subject, S, right? Just S for subject. And so an act is right or moral or good or whatever. But the whole idea is that if and only if, provided that X results in at least as much overall well-being as any other act, S, the agent, could have performed. So I put a few asterisks in here just to give you an idea that there's a lot of stuff actually buried in this supposedly simplistic notion of act utilitarianism. So let's just think about it a little bit. And I'm just scratching the surface. There's a lot more stuff going on in this chapter that you can dive into. But if you find this interesting, you can explore the chapter in more detail on your own. Okay, so first thing. X is right if X results in at least as much, if the consequences, at least as much. All right, so what we're talking about then is S, the subject, has a whole bunch of possible actions, right? Possibilities, right? Act could have performed any other act, so there'd be possibilities open at the time. So I'm an agent. There's all different kinds of things I could do, and what I try to do, according to pick the right thing to do, is I pick that action that's going to have the consequences will be at least as much good consequences as any other action. So if I have, X, Y, Z, a variety of things, then I look for the one that's going to give the most good or the best results, or maybe there's two or three that are equal. So then if you have two or three that are equal, then you can pick. Utilitarianism in this form really doesn't tell you which one to pick, right? So there is a sense, there is kind of an incompleteness of act utilitarianism if it so turns out that there's multiple options that would yield the same amount of goodness. Intuitively we might say, well, there still is one that might be better than the others. But according to the theory, you're not supposed to cheat on your theory. The act utilitarianism wouldn't distinguish. It would just say, well, maybe you have 2 or 3 possibilities that are all equally good or equally right. And then at the other end could be 3 or 4 things that are all equally bad because they're the minimum. So what you're trying to do then is you're trying to maximize well-being. Now, sometimes people say, well, this kind of can get out of hand, right? It doesn't leave any room for a natural distinction of going beyond the call of duty. So sometimes we say, well, let's say you're walking by somebody on the street and you want to help them a little bit, maybe they're lost or something. Does it do some good to perform the action of helping them? Sure, as opposed to just walking by. But then again, how much help do you have to give? Like, do you have to spend all day showing the person around, or is it enough? Like, that would be very nice if you did that. But maybe you just help them a little bit, like they're just looking for a grocery store, and then you help them like that, and you send them on their way, and you're not spending all day. But there would be more good in the action of helping them even more. And so, in that sense, does act utilitarianism demand that you just, well, I'm going to give up my entire day to this person I don't know in order to maximize? So it wouldn't even leave the notion of going beyond the call of duty. It would make everything extreme, not going beyond, but simply your duty, or you should do that. You would, always be, completely maximizing everything. It tries to put the brakes on that by saying that you're really just, what are the real possibilities at the time? It would be not just helping the person completely on the street there, but either I give them some directions or I ignore them. Well, that's really the set of choices. So there is some play in the idea of what exactly the choice set, right? So when you look at any other act that you could have performed, there has to be some idea of boundaries in here, and that's always a typical problem in utilitarianism, is trying to ascribe boundaries. Like, what exactly are the actions open to me as a subject in a given situation? The answer to that question doesn't just fall out of heaven. It's not self-evident. You have to think about that. So when people are asking questions about what are the possible actions at a given moment, they're making decisions. So you want to think about how those acts that choice set is circumscribed in the first place. All right, but the idea is you maximize, you get the best value out of that choice set. And so it's trying to avoid, this going all out. That's the problem of the denial of supererogatory acts, where if you just say that everything is your duty, then there's no room for going beyond the call of duty, because duty is everything. All right. So you're trying to maximize your well-being. You're looking at your choice set of acts. You're trying to pick the one that's good. And so it's extremely broad in one sense that it has act utilitarianism has a difficult relationship, as you'll see explained in the chapter, with rules. But what are the boundaries of ascertaining what are the results of an act? Like, how far do they go? Sort of that ripple effect. Does it go off infinitely into the future? How should we judge this? So how do you even judge what the consequences of an act are? That's not easy. And once again, you have to make decisions. So there's an extremely broad one. And there's also something extremely narrow, because it just looks at sort of, in a sense, the simple results. It doesn't really look at intention. So, and we in ordinary society and in the law, we do bring in, intentions. If you say something that's maybe not very nice and it has negative effects on people, we don't just look at those effects, right? We often, pretty well always, look at what's the context. So some kinds of language that has negative effects would be one thing, but all of a sudden, if it's determined that it's a form of hate speech, then we look at that quite differently, right? Even though the effects might still be the same in terms of the recipient of it, it might bother them as much or as little or whatever, but we would tend to say it's a more serious thing if it's let's say a discriminatory or whatever, as opposed to maybe just some kind of outburst or whatever. And so the two situations could, in terms of their actual effects be very similar. So then act utilitarianism would be quite narrow and say, well, they're basically equally good or bad or whatnot. But we might intuitively say, no, that one wasn't hate speech and that one was. This is very different. So some people say that the notion of act utilitarianism, while it might be a little cleaner and straightforward, maybe it leaves out too much. Now, here's the thing. That's an intuition about a theory, and we all know from science. If you study any science, often good theories violate our intuitions, right? So what about things like quantum mechanics and relativity? We have certain intuitions about causality and the way the world works and time, and those theories just say, well, the world isn't like that, and so much and so if you say, but my common sense tells me, well, science often says so much for common sense. We get different results in the lab and with our theories, etc., etc. So why not with morality too? So it might be that our intuitions, that if they are violated by this straightforward theory, you have to make some kinds of decisions and look at it and say, well, is it the theory that's wrong? Is it my intuitions? And so there's some sort of, we could say, some meta-ethical choices to make. So there you go. That's a rough introduction to a very rich and interesting chapter on act utilitarianism. And so the beauty is its simplicity. It's a straightforward one. It's looking at the results of actions by singular agents. But of course, it's going to, and I'm saving this for another video, it has a difficult relationship to rules. So some of the criticisms of act utilitarianism say that when you think about what we would intuitively regard as ethical, we tend to move away from looking at the consequences of actions and look more to consequences of rules. But when you start making that kind of distinction, you're off and out of the notion of act utilitarianism. And not surprisingly, if you're looking more at rules as the basis of which you look at the consequences of, so instead of actions, you're looking at rules, not surprisingly, you're in the domain of rule utilitarianism. And that too has its problems and its benefits, just like act utilitarianism does. But rule utilitarianism is a subject for another video.